and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from all around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. I am finally feeling better, hooray! And now I am completely free of employment and sickness, and hopefully we can go ahead unrestrained into the podcast world again. We have been doing this now for over 4 years, so it's really cool. We're 172 episodes in, and may we just keep going. This week's monster is not a recommendation, but a personal favourite that I've been wanting to cover for a while. So let's hop straight in, shall we? This week we're heading over to the lovely Greek and Roman Isles, and we are looking at another legendary mythological creature, the Dryad. Dryads are typically described as nature sprites within Greek and Roman mythology, who are always female and usually the most beautiful women you have ever seen. They have long flowing hair made of vines, branches or leaves, which reflect the season they're in, with glowing amber or green eyes, and a bark-like skin, which can be rough like an oak or as smooth as a willow. They often have limbs replaced or covered with foliage such as tree trunks, roots or branches, and they blend in perfectly within their forest home. I will note that within modern media, you may also see dryads as four-legged, deer-like creatures rather than just woody women. There's nothing in mythology to support that they were ever deer hybrids. It is just a popular look for them within TVs, movies and video games. Now, I did mention that they were nature spirits, and whilst this is true, it's more specific than that. Dryads are specifically tree spirits, embodying the plants and flora around them in their looks, but also within their nature. They are peaceful, shy creatures and avoid anyone at almost any cost, due to the lustful nature of those that seek them. When the coast is clear, they love to dance and sing with their male counterparts, the satyr, which we will cover in another episode in the future. Dryads live deep in forests, particularly within Greece and Italy, as their mythology reports, but they were also believed to live in every forest in the world, and were nowhere near going extinct. Because of their shy and camouflaging nature, they did typically avoid all of those they wanted to, but they enjoyed the company of certain gods, mostly Pan, Artemis and Dionysus, gods of nature, hunting and partying respectively. They are usually linked to a certain tree within all of these forests that the Dryad calls home, and they reflect on their appearance and they can retreat there if needed, if humans come about or if a certain god would come to hunt them. Now, their powers are interesting, as they are often considered to be lesser goddesses, so they are naturally quite wise. They also have extremely long lifespans and are sometimes considered immortal. However, if their tree home is cut down, they can die or be severely weakened by it. However, they cannot be harmed in their own environment physically, as they take power from the land around them to stay strong and from their tree home. So the Achilles heel, pardon my Greek pun, is to take down the tree rather than the Dryad. But of course, their main powers are connected to all around them. They have the power to manipulate all plants and trees, and have significant influence over all living souls within their forests, which can include things like bears and deer, for instance. They are also able to shapeshift in and out of animal and tree form to help defend themselves, and they also have a healing power through touch. This also includes being able to restore the balance within their environment, which means they can bring back dead plants or animals that are needed, or they can cause certain weather to help assist the forest, such as winds to carry seeds or rain to water things. Lastly, on humans, they do have the power of charm and enchantment, and are able to hypnotise humans to do their bidding if needed. However, that can be a bit ropey dependent on how strong the person is. For instance, if there were human invaders, they can influence them to turn around and leave. But they could also influence emotions, which in history has turned men to be extremely aggressive and possessive of them, including that kind of lustful drive that they have. But they can also inspire peace, joy and awe in that too. Their main task, of course, is to guard the forest that they live in, and they will defend it fiercely. They use their powers to encourage the trees and animals to fight, as well as physically getting involved themselves with their magic or within their shape-shifted forms. Dryads can be quite scary, and they will defend their home till their last breath, so it is not worth disturbing them. A good note here as well is because trees are sentient within Greek myth, if you were to damage any Greek tree, you would be punished by the gods if you didn't ask the Dryad it belongs to first. So it is super not worth it to be struck down by a lightning bolt. Now strangely, you could be born into being a Dryad, but usually you would be the daughter of some form of god or nymph. But you could also be turned into a Dryad, and that was actually pretty common. Dryads are defined as a type of nymph, which is another myth monster within the Greek and Roman mythologies. These are all nature spirits, so nymph is kind of an umbrella term and dryads are within that. Dryads within this are specifically tree nymphs. I will go into nymphs more later on, but there are also many different types of dryad. There are the Daphne, who are the nymphs of laurel trees specifically. This is important, they're linked to a very important myth which I'll tell you later on. The Epimelides, who were the nymphs of fruit trees, which included the Hesperides, who guard the golden apples. If you do want to know more about them, have a listen to my Labours of Heracles episode. There's like a whole bit about them. I won't cover them in this podcast. We also have the Hamadryads, who are the more generic dryads that I've described here, ones that are attached to certain trees, and the Melanae, who are dryads of ash trees. These have their own separate category because they are so important within Greek myth, so again, I'll tell you their myth later on. There are also the Oreads, who are mountain conifers, but are also sometimes known as the mountains themselves, and the Ampeloi, who are the dryads of grapevines, who, as you can imagine, are really great at parties. It is super typical for gods and heroes to go after nymphs and dryads, and a lot of them are known by name because of these chases, such as Daphne, Eurydice or Melia, all names that you might have heard of if you're interested in Greek myth. I'd recommend having a look at all the nymph stories, but I will tell you all of the big ones later on. Before I tell you about these lovely ladies though, let's talk about etymology. It's a pretty simple one this week. Of course, dryad is a Greek word, and it comes from the root word dris, meaning tree, but more specifically it means oak. And whilst we don't think of dryads specifically being associated with oak trees, the generic word dryad very literally means oak, and implies that they kind of came from oak trees originally. I'm not going to go massively into nymphs here, but just for your information, nymph is also Greek, and it means maiden or girl, but it can also mean bride. So moving on to history, I'm sorry to say that like with all of our ancient Greek monsters and any other ancient civilization monsters, it is a struggle to put down a specific date on when they came into folklore. What I can tell you is that the ancient Greeks were about and writing stuff about them from around 800 BC to 146 BC, when the epic poets and writers were all alive. Also note that before 0, time went backwards, so we're getting closer towards where we are, if that makes sense. But the more interesting thing about dryads is the myths around them. And I did mention that nymphs were chased by the gods multiple times, and I have many a story on that, but how does this relate to dryads? Well, this is because turning a nymph into a dryad was a very common thing to do, and was actually seen as more of an escape from these gods and men, and a blessing from the gods of protection, rather than it being a curse of being stuck as a tree forever. The men, of course, would stop chasing them, and the nymph would be free from them to be a dryad instead of their generic nymphness, or whatever kind of nymph they were before. This is a really common theme, so I wanted to pre-warn you first before I kind of get into these stories. And also, it's a pre-warning for men chasing after women specifically to assault them in these stories. Don't say I didn't warn you, they're not graphic, I haven't said anything particularly gruesome, but if you're upset by this kind of thing, you might want to skip some of these. So we'll start off with the most famous dryad, Daphne. Daphne was a nymph, and she was a follower of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and famously celibate, and very anti-romance and sex for her followers and herself. One day, the god of light, Apollo, and Artemis's twin brother, I hasten to add, was struck by one of the golden arrows of love from Eros, god of love. He saw Daphne playing with his sister and immediately had to have her. He chased Daphne for days, always a step behind her, and eventually the exhausted Daphne called out to her father, a river god, to save her from Apollo. To do that, her dad turned her into a laurel tree immediately on the spot, and Apollo ran into Daphne, now this beautiful laurel tree. Apollo was devastated and declared that the laurel tree would now be sacred to him, and took a branch from Daphne's tree to wear around his head as a symbol of his eternal love for her. Hence, the laurel is still one of Apollo's symbols, and the laurel crown is now synonymous with the Greek pantheon. I think it's a bit rapey, if anything, but we move. I mentioned Eurydice, who is a character from my favourite Greek myth, Orpheus and Eurydice. She was a tree nymph who married the most talented musician alive, but died the night before their wedding. He ventured into the underworld to save her, and was told he could walk her back to the surface if he didn't turn around to look for her during the journey. As he got to their front door, he turned to check, and she was pulled back into the underworld for good. Now, there aren't many references to Eurydice's druidic nature throughout this, but she is noted as a tree spirit and a tree nymph, so I get a chance to tell this story again. If you've ever seen the Hadestown musical, you can go and see their story played out. Melia and the Meliae are my next story, and they were a group of dryads who were particularly special. These are the ash tree dryads, and these were born differently to all of the others. They were formed from the drops of blood that fell onto the earth when the titan Kronos castrated his father, the titan Uranus. The earth in Greek mythology is the body of the titaness Gaia, or Mother Earth, and she then became pregnant with the Meliae. They lived in the Cretan Dictae Mountains, and when the king of the Greek god Zeus was born to a father she knew would try and eat him, the titaness Rhea gave her youngest son to the Meliae to raise him away from Kronos. They fed him honey and the milk of a goat turned into by the nymph Amalthea. Unfortunately though, when Zeus does grow up and try to take down his dad, the oracle advises him to use the goat's skin as a weapon, and he then kills the nymph and fashions the Aegis from her as a thank you, I guess. But it does help take down the Titans, so it does the job. Lastly, for our Greeks, we have the infamous Battle of Troy, where the Dryads kind of got involved. The battle destroyed the forests around the city, and the Dryads absolutely lost it. So they used their powers to hinder the invading Greeks, like growing trees in their paths or blocking ways with vines and plants, even trapping soldiers along the way. I have one last story for you, and it's actually from the Roman mythology side, and it's of the Dryad Luce, who was loved by the god of the underworld, Pluto. He abducted her, as he does throughout myths, and she lived in the underworld with him until her death. when Pluto turned her body into a white poplar tree and placed her in the Elysian Fields, one of the higher floors of the underworld, which was reserved for very honoured people and warriors. Later on, when Heracles came to the underworld for one of his labours, as he was leaving, he took a branch from her tree as a sign of victory, and he actually ended up crowning himself with it, and you can see this within art of Heracles too. Well, that's all of my stories, but we do have a couple of mythical comparisons for dryads across the rest of the world of mythology. For instance, we have the Gilly-Doo from Scottish folklore, a male protector of the forests, the Kodama from Japanese mythology, who protected and inhabited trees across Japan. We also have the Capre from Philippine folklore, who guard the forest and sit in mango trees smoking cigars, whilst watching for outsiders. We have covered the Capre before, if you're more interested to hear about them. Or the Redande from Swedish folklore, who are called grove folk, and they watch over specific trees in the forest with a deadly intent. I guess kind of similar to the Dryads. They're very often put in the same bucket. Now, let's move on to modern media though. There are absolutely loads of things for Dryads, so I hope you are ready. For art, there are a bunch of portraits with Dryads in them, but my personal favourites are The Dryad by Evelyn de Morgan from 1885, Francis Danby's The Wood Nymph Hymn to the Rising Sun from 1845, Emile Bin's The Hamadryad from 1870, Felicien Ropp's Hamadryad from 1885, and The Last Dryad by Gabriel Guay from 1898. Otherwise, have a look at independent art this week for some really beautiful art around this monster. However, it does tend to be very, very out there in terms of their nature influence, and you will see that four-legged type everywhere. In movies, we have Hercules, Barbie Fairytopia, Mavka the Forest Song, The Guardian, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Maleficent, Batman and Robin, and Epic. For TV, we have Delicious in Dungeon, Overlord, Rosario plus Vampire, Once Upon a Time, Power Rangers, Doctor Who, Charmed, Batman the Animated Series, Cropopolis, Monster Mesame, PJ Masks, Hercules, Thundercats, and Wakfu. In video games, we have ones such as World of Warcraft, Unavowed, Fable, Elder Scrolls, Age of Wonders, Tavern Talk, A Very Long Rope to the Top of the Sky, Terraria, Rayman, Final Fantasy, Avowed, Quest for Glory, Age of Mythology, Zork, The Witcher, Baldur's Gate, Dragon Age Origins, Guild Wars, Legend of Zelda, Neverwinter Nights, Pokemon, Touhou Project, Batman the Arkham series, World of Mana, and Total War Warhammer. I do hope you're noticing that I'm throwing in Batman references here, and that is realistically because Poison Ivy is a Dryad, and anything that she's in, she deserves to be mentioned in this category. She truly is just a Dryad, but a sexy version. Now, my book recommendation this week is Greek Mythology, The God, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook by Liv Albert, who runs the podcast Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. Or you can have a look at my classic Stephen Fry Heroes or Mythos, because these are some of my favourite Greek mythology books out there. They're a lot of fun, and Stephen Fry truly is the great treasure of Britain. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? I'm going to say no. Sorry. The Greeks made it very easy to say yes or no to their monsters, and this is one of them that I can't say I'm behind. I say this as I can't really imagine a barky maiden peeking out of a tree, but that's not to say that I don't think they could potentially be hiding away and could possibly exist. I'm just saying that it's such a small possibility that I'm gonna say no. Also, with the destruction of our forests in the Amazon, surely if something like Dryads were about to defend them, we would definitely have found out by now. We all know that forests and woods are ancient places with so much folklore and mystery behind them. But I think whilst Dryads aren't there, it would be really great if they were, for the sake of our planet and all that live in it. I do really love these monsters though. I was first properly introduced to Dryads through World of Warcraft when I was a teenager, and I always thought they were the Fey-touch deer hybrids that they present in that. It was only when I really started studying Greek myth when I was in my early 20s that I realised that they were just women with tree powers, like Poison Ivy from Batman. There is a very funny part in Disney's Hercules though, where Philoctetes is chasing after nymphs and one of them turns into a tree and slaps him for chasing her, but it's not stressed that she's a dryad at this point, which is kind of sad. However, I will note that within mythology, Philoctetes is not a satyr either, so Disney are definitely not the best at telling the truth in these cases. But what do you think? Did the Dryads protect the Earth's forest? Let me know on social media. I would love to know what you think about this one. That was one of my absolute favourites this week. I'm really glad we finally got to cover them. And I think if I could be any mythical creature that I could choose, it would be a Dryad. I just think they're neat. Just a quick note from me. I really love your recommendations. Please keep sending them in for me to look at. But I am just a single person. I get a lot of requests and I do my running order a year in advance and I try not to change it. So if you do send me any recommendations, I will get to them as quickly as I can. Sometimes I can't cover monsters because they don't have enough information on them. So please don't chase me. I will get to them as soon as I can. I'm not obligated to add them in at all, may I hasten to add. I'm just trying my best. Please be patient. Please be kind. That's all I want to say. Next week, though, we are heading on over to Eastern Europe for a watery nymph instead. That's right, we are looking at the wonderful and deadly Rusalka. Don't let these soggy ladies be tempting you in with them next Thursday. For now, thank you so much for listening. It's an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got loads of social media for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But I'm also now on Blue Sky under Myth Monsters, which I'm trying to get into. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk. You can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast as well. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.